final part of Siegel's Chapter 5 involves discussion of psychological trait theories. We just finished, of course, talking about biological trait theories. And psychological trait theories begin pretty much with the work of Sigmund Freud, who most people know. Most everyone knows his name these days. He's probably one of the 5 greatest thinkers of the past century, and his ideas about psychoanalytic theory and the id, ego, superego differences. What I like to stress with this is that Freud was coming up with a theory about what makes human beings unique as a species, and he found that their minds are unique. He found 3 different parts to the human mind, making that different from animals. What we have in common with animals is the id. All right? The id is our basic drives. It follows the pleasure principle, as it says there, libidinous energy, demanding immediate satisfaction. And the id is unconscious. It's your desire to eat, it's your desire to sleep. It also follows other primal needs like sex and aggression. Okay? So I like to think of id as related to drives. The ego is the mediator between the id and the superego. And the ego is really between conscious and unconscious. It's based on what's happening in reality right now at this moment. So it works on the reality principle, and so involved in doing things like basic memory, problem solving, reality testing, and making inferences, right? And it allows for that psychic balance, but it's basically the who you are in the moment. The superego is our conscience, and I want to stress that it's not our conscious, it's our conscience. And so what we have here is it's the source of moral standards and values. This superego is what makes us fundamentally different from animals. Animals don't sit around saying, oh, please and thank you, and what will my mother think of me if I were to do this or that? This is a particularly human characteristic. We have moral standards and values, and what happens is we develop, in many instances, an oppressive morality. So if you're on the verge, as sometimes we all are, of doing something very stupid, right? You might hear your mother's voice in your head saying, Kurt, what are you doing? Fill in your own name with that. And that inhibits us from doing bad behavior. So these societal and parental inhibitions and prohibitions allow us to have self-imposed standards for our behavior. So what's amazing to think about is the extent to which you are the personality that you came into the world with, combined with all of those social forces that told you, no, don't, stop, not yet, think twice. And those eventually become part of you as well. A question that can be raised with Freud's id, ego, superego differentiations is, how does that relate to some type of feeling of consistency and balance? And what I'd like to do is to draw something for you, but first I'll mention that psychoanalysts, counselors tend to see criminals as id-dominated, that the id is the strongest force in a person. So let me draw it thusly. So if we have like a, let's say I draw a basic teeter-totter here, or a fulcrum, your id would be on one side, right? Your id, then this will be, I'll just write an E for ego, and as it disappears, the other side would be the superego, the other side of the teeter-totter, right? So this would be ideally balanced, right? What can happen, though, is that one part of this may become more dominant. If the id becomes more dominant, then you're driven by your drives, and you don't have social controls that you've internalized. Therefore, you might be incapable of control. And psychopaths may be very much id-dominated. They don't care about norms, values, morals. Conversely, though, you can have psychological problems also if you are superego dominated. And the reason for this is because those people might become very, very repressed and unable to express some of their basic inner drives and desires. And that can cause psychological problems too. But the main way that criminologists focus on psychoanalytic theory is an id that is not controlled sufficiently by a superego. Next, there's some discussion in your text about attachment theory, and this relates to the idea of human beings being very, very dependent as a species. We come out of the womb needing years of care and feeding and love and nurturing before we are even able to begin taking care of ourselves, right? And that makes us different from a lot of other species. We're so dependent. The attachment theory idea is that children need to form attachments very early in their life. And primarily, they need to form these with a mother or a similar mother-like figure. And if they don't have warm, healthy, and sustained interactions with that figure, they are likely to express psychological symptoms and problems similar to those of ADHD, which we discussed previously, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So it's a basic idea that stability and a warm, nurturing relationship between a child and a mother helps inhibit some more antisocial tendencies which would come because the child has never made those kinds of attachments that can allow it to feel comfort and a sense of equilibrium. There's a brief discussion too about mood disorders in your chapter, and there are several of them that are mentioned: disruptive behavioral disorder, and two types of those. There's this idea of oppositional defiant disorder, and the one that your text points out is the most serious of all, conduct disorder, which can be abbreviated CD there. And this is one which, again, your text mentions as an important thing to watch out for. Let's see, it talks about here the idea of problems. CD is typically considered a more serious behavioral and emotional problem. Children who have CD have great difficulty following rules and behaving in socially acceptable ways. So this is something, again, that can be of concern to criminologists. Where do some of these tendencies start? There's a discussion, too, about crime and mental illness. And this is a very controversial element in dealing with criminals, the criminal justice system. There are terms that a lot of people throw around, such as psychosis and schizophrenia. Those are defined a little more specifically in your text. The idea of schizophrenia, extreme impairment of a person's ability to think clearly, respond emotionally, communicate effectively, understand reality, and behave in an appropriate manner. There's a big question about how criminals with mental illness should be treated. Is this a disease? And if it is a disease, then to what extent is the person choosing bad behavior? And that really leads to questions about whether or not this should be dealt with through punishment or some type of treatment. And there are also questions about what should be done with people who are mentally ill who've been convicted of crimes. One big problem in the criminal justice system, and in particular corrections, is the idea that those people who have mental illness may not get the help they need in prison. So there's a big question about, are there adequate facilities for treating mentally ill people in prison? And generally the answer is no. There's quite a lack of those facilities to treat mentally ill people, and that leads to some questions about whether or not we ought to be treating mental illness in a community setting before those people perhaps end up in a place like prison. Something that's not mentioned in your textbook that I still would like you to know about related to mental illness and crime is this idea of what's called the Mcnaughton Rule, which is an old English law in about the mid-1850s. And the general statement here I have reproduced, which is that it's about how a person might establish grounds of defense based on insanity. And it's that basically it must be clearly proved that when the person committed the act, the person was laboring under such a defect of reason, disease of mind, and not know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or if he did know it, that he did not know what he was doing was wrong. So the Mcnaughton Rule is a basic principle for the development of things like an insanity plea, or the idea of mental illness as mitigating what might count as crime. So in simpler terms here, I've written that the defendant is supposed to know the difference between right and wrong in order to be convicted of a crime. And that is something that can be invoked as a defense, that the defendant did not know right from wrong, maybe did not have the mental capacity to know that what he or she was doing was criminal. That is the ideal. In everyday reality in court proceedings. We find that, in fact, juries might not really care much about whether or not the person knew right from wrong, and may be very suspect about this type of defense, because they may think that the defendant is possibly lying, pulling the wool over their eyes, in order to avoid punishment. So it's very hard to prove definitively that someone's mentally ill, and there can also be experts found that contradict that. So that might lead juries to say, well, we should deal with this in the maximum possible punishment. And that also too reflects the second bullet point. Juries might think that the defendant deserves punishment no matter what, even if they think the person was not mentally right. They still want retribution of some type, which is, again, part of the logic of why we have criminal justice systems. People, to some extent, want retribution for criminal acts. Another branch of theory under psychological theories we can look at, cognitive theory, is focused on moral development. So all of us develop as moral beings over time. When we come out of the womb, we have no concept of morality. We have no concept of right or wrong. These things develop over time. And children have developmental stages that they go through. At certain points, they can't understand, for example, the difference between 1, 2, and 3. Their brains have to form enough so that they're capable of learning those things. So this is about cognition, mental processes. Individuals must grow self-aware, and they have to learn how to make sense of information, to make decisions that are seen as appropriate, right? So there are two big theorists who are discussed in this section, Jean Piaget and Lawrence Kohlberg, and each one is talking a little bit about these developments, right, within every human being. Individuals' reasoning, according to Piaget, their processes of reasoning develop in an orderly fashion from ages 0 to 12. And these involve stages, again, where children are able to develop reasoning at higher levels. If a child is unable to develop that, then that may lead to them being unable to understand the link between their actions and some kind of consequence, for example. Kohlberg is focusing more on moral development and the idea that every individual goes through stages of moral development. Some people stay stuck in a stage of moral development, which is that if I do bad things, I will get punished. A lot of people, though, hopefully reach the stage where they say, well, I should not do bad things because that's just generally bad for all people. That hurts everyone, and I don't want to do that. It's bad for my fellow human beings, right? But the idea here is that the people who reach those advanced stages are going to be less likely to be criminal, and they're going to need fewer forces that make them behave well, right? And that's really a crucial element of humans that hopefully keep us social and able to be in groups. So the final part here then is everyone makes decisions, and the decision an individual might make to commit crime could be a function of how they reason and their level of moral development. If either one of them is lacking, that may result in crime. There has also been research on psychological traits and characteristics, and some of this is discussed in your text by Sheldon and Eleanor Gluck in the 1950s in the United States. They did a large-scale study of families and delinquency and studies of youth, and in particular they looked at some antisocial youth and their characteristics. And many of these will probably come as no surprise to most people, that if you look at antisocial youth, they found many possible characteristics related to that. They're very self-assertive. They may be sadists, share a lack of concern for others, a lack of empathy, right? Maybe generally defiant, extroverts. They have an ambivalence or a feeling of not caring about things. Impulsiveness, which we saw linked to several other things related to, for example, biology. Narcissism, extensive self-involvement. Distrust of authority figures. That can, of course, play into whether or not someone wants to follow rules or not. Mental instability, it can be psychological, it can be biological. General feelings of hostility, resentment. Poor personal skills, and what's interesting now is sometimes they're focusing on verbal skills, and the fact that in some instances the verbal skills of people who are criminal are much lower. So there's a question of whether or not criminals are able to express themselves, and if that were more possible, would that have potentially stopped them from committing crime? And then, of course, too, with the link between personal skills, a feeling of not being appreciated could certainly be detrimental to self-esteem and might cause someone to look for self-esteem in other ways besides legitimate opportunities. There's a little discussion too about the relationship between IQ and crime. Actually, it's not a very little discussion, it's fairly long. What I'd like to say in 2 sentences is that there are many of these studies, and you can look at all of them if you want to, but what you'll find is that it's very hard to draw conclusions because there are many studies with different kinds of findings. So the findings for these in general are inconclusive. Finally, in this chapter, we end with the public policy implications of trait theory, trait theories. There seem to be 2 that they draw toward the end of this chapter. And they're both interesting. One of them here, it says, you could fund what are called primary prevention programs. And those are programs that would preempt crime. And they would preempt crime by allowing people to get treatment for personal problems, maybe problems related to biology, maybe related to psychology. So that policy implication might promote things like the funding of community health clinics, where people can get treatment no matter what their income level, community mental health centers and community mental health services, which many have argued are woefully underfunded these days, and other things like, for example, counseling and healthcare in schools, which in some instances has been cut substantially because of budget constraints. But the idea here is that there might be a way to avoid crime by preventative, preemptive kind of measures that are generally oriented toward social health and the idea of promoting that. The problem is that many people wouldn't think about funding these things in order to prevent crime because you can't measure something that isn't there. Now let me clarify what I mean. If you fund those kinds of resources, you can't say afterwards, look how much crime has been stopped by this. You might see a reduction in crime, but it's not necessarily directly attributable to the funding of those kinds of programs. So again, you can't count something that didn't happen. It might result in lesser crime, and it probably would, but you wouldn't necessarily have the data to say, oh, this is the reason that the crime has dropped. So for many people, even though this is a very logical policy implication, people don't see it directly connected with crime, and therefore it might not be terribly popular. The idea of secondary prevention programs might be more popular, and that's because they are linking things like the possibility of counseling to those people who are more at risk of offending. So somebody, for example, who has had some run-ins with the law or something like this, being able to access those kinds of problems. And of course, the issue is whether or not you are investing money to stop crime more generally, again with the primary type programs, or more specifically with certain individuals, and which is the better approach. It's hard to say. The final questions raised in your text there about trait theories, some of these policies would suggest that maybe the state should intervene directly in the ways in which individuals live, even in terms of their biology. So one question is if somebody has been convicted of a crime, does the state have the right to make those prisoners take drugs or have some type of surgery in order to control their behavior? This is very contentious because what happens is it raises a lot of ethical issues and questions about individuals' rights. Do we want to have a society where people lose their right to self-determination and control of their own bodies when they commit a crime or are found guilty of a crime? Some people would say the state is reaching a bit too far if they think that that should be allowed. Other people say, well, maybe it should be something voluntary by the prisoner's choice, whether or not to do those types of things. And that's something that we, as a society, are probably going to debate for quite a while.